Hey, I want to welcome you to the Living Grounded podcast. So glad you joined us today. So, what happens to our mental health when life moves at the speed of Wi-Fi? In this episode of Living Grounded, we're going to sit down with Dr. Debbie Schratz. She's a counselor, a professor, a mom, and a grandmother. We're going to explore how smartphones, social media, and the constant digital connections are reshaping the way we live and the way we feel and the way we relate to one another. From screen addictions to digital burnout to anxiety fueled by endless comparisons. We're going to dig into the very real ways technology can either drain us or support our mental well-being. Debbie offers some eye-opening insight and grounded tools for recognizing the signs of digital fatigue, setting boundaries with tech, and embracing the benefits of technology without letting it take over. Whether you're a parent or a professional or simply feeling stretched too thin by screen time, this episode is an invitation just to pause and to breathe and to reconnect. Here's my conversation with Debbie Schratz. Well, Debbie, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I love it.
Well, I just appreciate you coming on and your expertise. And we've talked about several topics over the last few times we've been together, but I'm pretty excited about this topic today. And I think there will be a lot of parents who will be interested in what you have to say and the guidance that you give as we talk about technology and mental health. It's kind of crazy that those two things are really meshing together as you look at research and as you look at the things out on the internet and some of the articles that are going out about mental health and how that relates to technology. So let's just start with that. With smartphones on the rise, and who doesn't have a smartphone now? It seems like social media. How has that changed the landscape of mental health over the last decade? You've been doing this for a little bit and you've seen the changes. So now with all this social media and technology, how do you see that impacting mental health?
So that's a big question because there's so many aspects to it. But over the last decade, and probably even increasing since COVID, the last 5 years. So, with the use of the internet itself, smartphones, tablets, and such, information is accessible at a rapid rate of speed. People are constantly using their smartphones to provide information, but specifically for mental health, if I'm thinking about people who have mental health issues, what technology has done for them in the last few years is really increase the awareness of what mental health is, because there's a stigma with mental health, and there has been. And since all this rise to technology and social media platforms, it's become destigmatized. And, individuals are able to share their personal experiences to what mental health is and what it means to them. And there's so many platforms for people with mental health and, and for anybody really. But I think there's a nice supportive community now that social media has provided for people with mental health. But I think in general, too, and especially since COVID, we see that there's many more platforms to seek help as far as mental health goes. So, we've always had telehealth, counselors have, but it was very expensive, and it still is to some extent, but most insurance companies would not reimburse. So we didn't use it. But COVID, of course, changed all that. So now, since COVID, and since now we have, everyone who was a counselor really uses telehealth to some extent, but there's counseling apps, there's therapy apps, there's crisis hotline apps, there's, basically immediate and supportive digital support, peer-to-peer support, wherever you look. So I think that's really the main change that we've seen as far as maybe the good part of what social media does, and maybe we'll talk more about the bad part in a little bit.
Well, kind of turn that corner. So So there's some great things out there. I have more access, and so it's some positive things about technology. And I think we need to remember that. Sometimes we can go right to the negative. Um, and uh, as I am on social media, one, uh, it's like waking hours. People are on the phone. Um, when I look at social media, I'm always looking at someone who's having the best day ever, and they're putting their best uh, face forward and experience forward. They're on vacation someplace. Um, Kids are great. They just won an award. How do you see that constant influx of everyone's best day ever, again, which is not really happening, but it feels like that. And then here I am, not going through my best day ever, struggling with kids, struggling with health, wish I could get away but can't, all those things. How do you see that impacting mental health?
It's a huge mental health and that issue in it, and you see it really over all age groups. And we'll talk more about who's maybe more vulnerable. But I tell people that I work with that nobody is going, for the most part. Now we do see people who are attention seeking, and obviously there's multiple aspects to that. But for the most part, nobody puts their worst days on Facebook. You're seeing beautiful pictures that are most often filtered. You're seeing highlight reels. You're seeing, influencers selling things. So you're seeing a lot of really good stuff, but it's not all accurate, and it's damaging because for people who are predisposed to issues such as depression and anxiety, they go and they do this passive scrolling thing on Facebook where they're just looking. They're not connecting with the content, they're just looking. And what that does is it creates this negativity in your brain that can lead to envy, it can lead to further depression, and it really does question, yourself. And even as adults, we may have the mental capacity to say, oh, that's not really real, but oftentimes we do not. And it bothers you. You might see someone on there that, that shows their husband is remodeling their house and doing all these things. And then you might think, why is my husband not doing that? And it's just a constant comparison, and which is never good.
When you talk to parents, you talk to young adults and teens as well. What age group do you think are most vulnerable when it comes to some of the challenges about social media?
Yeah. I mean, I want to say that there's challenges that all age groups, from infants to old people, have when it comes to social media and overuse of social media. But um, what research shows is the most vulnerable group that social media, too much of the, social media is adolescents ages 12 to 18. So you're talking about middle school to high school. And they are most at risk for increased anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, poor body image, and sleep disturbances. And mainly because, well, a few things, but teens are, at that critical stage of identity formation. And it's so important. They're still having developmental issues, and they're more susceptible to what we talked about just a minute ago with comparison. So we're seeing, this constant comparison and cyberbullying. We're seeing this word, if you've ever heard of it, called FOMO, which is fear of missing out. And it leads all to this digital dependency, which is my favorite part, have this brain connection, But young adults too are vulnerable because we're seeing that college age and young adults who are becoming addicted to social media, and they're having issues with being distracted. They're having sleep disturbances. They're missing out on that face to face interaction, and those two age groups are most susceptible, but children are too. And we can talk a little more about that. But I think what's important for parents to know, and I'll probably might get some hate mail about this, but children are very susceptible, specifically 5 and under. And the reason why 5 and under are a little more susceptible is because that's when they're developing, of course, physically, but cognitively, emotionally, they're developing. And language is one of those most important things. If you've seen babies, they babble and they make these sounds, and they are looking at our mouths and we're repeating these sounds because that's how they learn language. Well, when you stick devices, in front of your children, for whatever reason, and I'm not judging, but the long-term effects of that is that they're going to have issues with language development. And I know parents that all they do is stick devices because they may think it's educational or it's, sweet baby sounds and things like that. But if we have time to talk about how it affects the brain, it does kind of affect them in a way that most people don't understand. And we're also seeing issues with, emotional regulation, with too much screen time, because what's happening is the screens are becoming their way of regulating. Instead of self-soothing in other ways, they're using the screen time to do it.
Can you give, just in layman's terms, can you give a little physiological explanation of the screen and what that does to our brain? And uh, I don't know how you can do it on your iPhone or your smartphone, but I can click 3 times a button with my thumb on my phone, and it goes black or black and white. And what's amazing is it's crazy. It's the same phone, it's the same information, but I don't want to look at it. But as soon as I click on back on the color, it's attractive to me, and I think like this is crazy that it became that attractive just with the color on it, and I don't want to look at it when it's on black and white. So I've also heard, don't read before you go to bed because it's some stimulation and stuff. So what's the science behind the screen and what it does to our brain?
This is like my favorite. I love this stuff. So just to understand what smartphone and social media does to the brain, it affects the brain structure, the function, and the behavior. And because you're talking about that blue screen, what it does is that social media and smartphone notifications, what they do is they activate dopamine. So, that's the feel-good neurotransmitter that we have. And it's just kind of like anything else. When you're eating your favorite dessert, or you're laughing with friends, or, you have a goal that you accomplished, your brain says, oh, that feels good, let's do it again. And that's the same kind of idea as what happens when our brains are seeing that blue screen. It's kind of like, and I hate this analogy, and I don't gamble, but you've seen people using slot machines, right? And so they use those slot machines, and they win. It feels good. Sometimes they don't win, but it's same kind of concept with social media and with looking at these screens, is that, for like the social media, sometimes you get likes, sometimes you don't. And the brain likes that unpredictability, believe it or not. It's called variable reinforcement. And what variable reinforcement does is it activates dopamine, things like social validation, instant gratification. It's like this never ending loop of dopamine. And that dopamine can lead to issues with addiction. And I think, trying to keep it less technical, we talk about the prefrontal cortex a lot. Well, the prefrontal cortex, if you remember, is the command center. It's where we get all of our input. It helps us with emotional regulation. It helps us planning and focusing and kind of weighing consequences. Well, just like the prefrontal cortex gets hijacked in that fear, fight or flight kind of response, it does the same with dopamine. So all this dopamine comes in and it hijacks the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex isn't able to weigh consequences, isn't able to like properly work through emotional regulation and things like that. And that's all from dopamine. So that's what's happening with your screen, and it's a little bit different for nighttime. What happens with nighttime is if you use your screen an hour or so before you go to bed, it causes issues with melatonin production. And melatonin helps you relax and helps you to sleep. So, that's one of the more technical reasons why you're kind of drawn to that screen.
Mm-hmm. So, we are going to have a podcast coming up with a guy who's been researching teenagers for years and years. And I'll wait for that podcast to let people know what he says. But Dr. Schratz, my child, what age should I, if I'm in a perfect world, what age should I wait for to allow my child to use a smartphone?
Well, so that really is a difficult question because using smartphones for the right reasons, like emergencies, and things like that, I think is important. I think we're seeing parents giving them to children younger and younger. But if we're talking specifically about what it does to the brain, I think, it's not necessarily a matter of age, but it's a matter of the amount and what else they're doing. So it's really a time kind of thing. And there's no particular time, although there's lots of like rules that we can talk about that kind of help with that have been researched. But it's really important that you do not allow, maybe for every 20 minutes of screen time, if it's a child, you replace that with 20 minutes of things that help them developmentally, like tactile things, touching a stuffed animal, coloring book, using that hand-eye coordination. All those kind of things, social interactions are very important. And those are the things that kind of take away when you're using screen time. Children are missing out on interactive play. They're missing out on play dates with children. So those kind of things socially they're missing out on. So I do think, and we can, kind of talk about this more with ideas, but parents have to be very, very diligent not to use social media as a babysitter. If you're out at a restaurant, I know, I get it. I've had crying kids, but when my kids were little, we didn't have devices. So I would bring, a little, bag of things for them to do while we were out. But I'm seeing parents more and more prop up screens to their infants, maybe to lull them to sleep or things like that. And it's very dangerous because it interferes with very important developmental things that they need.
So as you interact with people, what would be some of the issues, the mental issues that would be directly related to technology? So someone comes in, they have this issue, and you say, so an easy one would be addictions, right? I mean, so whether it's pornography or whether it's gambling or so many things now, you just do it right on your phone, and people are making it easier and easier. What would be some of the other things we may not think about that would that technology would be a cause of?
Well, we are seeing an increase in depression and anxiety. So I think it would depend on what age group is coming, in front of me. So if it's a teenager, I would definitely go right to, how much time do you spend on social media? Because there's so many things involved. And we talked about before about being predisposed to these, to depression and anxiety. So it would be important to, always get a full health history. But I would want to know, what are some of the things that are going on in their lives? Are they withdrawn? Are they, being depressed? Are they having anxiety? Are they having sleep disturbances? Because those are some of the things that we see with, excessive use of screen time and social media. And I think you even mentioned a little bit about digital fatigue. And so those are things that we would look to as well, stuff that we talked about with being burnt out. Are you irritable? What's your emotions kind of all over the place? And believe it or not, you do have to dig a little bit because those symptoms can be for multiple reasons, and it can be almost like a domino effect. So again, we're seeing eye strain, headaches, we're seeing tech neck. And those are medical things, but they're caused from, not just kids are getting it from just too much screen time, but just adults who are working. Like I work primarily online. So if I'm not taking a break, I'm having, migraines and headaches and things like that. So I think, obviously getting the big picture of what's going on is so important. And if we can narrow it down, and understand, well, yeah, my kid's on social media all the time. They're just, they're getting more and more depressed. They're not hanging out with friends. There's no social interactions. Then those are some of the red flags that we need to look at.
Debbie, talk about the impact of the fatigue. Um, many years ago, I remember technology was going to decrease our work hours from 40 hours a week to 30. I can't remember what the numbers, but in fact, it has caused us to always be on. And I personally struggle with this because, there was a day I've lived before there were smartphones, and if someone passed away or if there was an emergency, someone would get a hold of me somehow. But now I feel like I need to have this with me just in case one of the kids reaches out or they need something. And so we kind of go to that. We kind of go to that place, right? That place. I got to have this in case something happens, and at the same time, I'm using it in ways that are not emergency related. And so you're never off. You're always on. And if you do get some downtime, then a text can come in and then you say, well, I could answer this tomorrow, but I'll just get it over with right now. And then pretty soon you've checked an email, and it's just like you can get to the point where you never stop. That has to be impacting people in a negative way.
Well, right, because what you just described is fear of missing out, really. And maybe it's not intentional because you do need your phone for emergencies, but it's back to that dopamine because you hear that notification or you hear that email notification and you are just saying, is that important? Or for kids, is that interesting? And so when you look at it, oh yeah, that's important. Believe it or not, dopamine is released, and so that's kind of how you get stuck in that. But I think, you make a good point because, technology is supposed to make it easier on us. And in some ways it has. But I think that, humans are, they need that validation. They need instant gratification. And so they're on all the time. And for people like myself, I have 7 emails for all the places I work, and I have to check them all the time. And I know what you mean. I feel like I'm on all the time, and kids, though, they don't have to be on all the time, but yet they're doing that. So see, and it's affecting you, and that digital fatigue, that tech fatigue is very, very real. And it's such a, it's not necessarily a new phenomenon, but it's definitely getting more research because people are coming in with these symptoms and these issues of complete mental exhaustion. And we talked about burnout and other things that can cause it, but when we're specifically talking about tech, that constant looking at digital screens and engagement, it really can cause lots of exhaustion. And one of the reasons is that, our brains are amazing, but our brains do have limits. So when we talk about cognitive overload or information overload, that's a real thing. And what happens then is, people start to have racing thoughts. And I get that sometimes because I'm like, oh, what if I miss something? And so you cannot relax because you do have to be on all the time. And we kind of are plugged in, and, society has kind of made us that way. And again, taking it back to when COVID happened, everybody went online. And so a lot of businesses found that it's more, productive for them, and, saves more money that they can have their employees online. So now they're online, whereas they might have been in an office situation, not necessarily on their computers all the time, but now they're face to face. They're doing all their meetings through Zoom and Teams, and, and so they are plugged in all the time. And just like I talked about with burnout, it is causing burnout. It's causing this decreased resilience to stressors, which, as I talked about, when you have that decreased resilience to stressors, you're going to be more at risk for burnout, depressive symptoms, anxiety, and all those things. And, and the physical part, like I said, the issues with eye strain and headaches, it's a real thing.
There's a book out, The Anxious Generation, and talking about how our teens today are demonstrating more anxiety than ever before. Do you believe that's part and parcel of technology? Do you believe technology is playing into that? Is it causing anxiety, or I don't even know how to ask this question, but I think sometimes there's real, and then there's the temptation to have an issue. So I know there's real anxiety, and then when you hear about it so often, and it's always in front of you, some people kind of morph into that. That's again bad way of saying all that. So in this anxious generation, how much of that is screen time causing that, and then just everybody's anxious, and so I'm part of this anxious generation?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it probably is all encompassing, maybe, because we are an anxious generation, because I think there's more expected of us, and there's more input everywhere, right? I mean, it's crazy from the time I grew up playing outside and rarely watching TV, to now screens are on in restaurants, screens are on everywhere you go. So I think, again, that we are predisposed to anxiety now, many of us, for a variety of reasons. But what screen time has done with that influx of dopamine and that instant gratification, I think it's really starting at that young age. Because when we think about like the boomer generation, and even somewhat my generation, Gen X, I'm kind of like at that early aspect of it. We have been kind of grandfathered into technology to some extent, like social media and stuff. I know how to use it, but my kids have known how to use it their entire lives. And so I see now, young kids from a young generation, since they are using it all the time, it's just so much comparison. And, when we go through these important stages, the kids do, that middle school age and things like that, where they're developing their identity, they are becoming anxious from the content that is kind of put out there. I don't see one teenager without an Instagram or a TikTok, and they're constantly, it's almost narcissistic to a point. I see kids filming themselves everywhere I go, and it causes anxiety not only for them, because then they need those likes, they need that feedback is constantly with them. They need those likes. When they don't get those likes, then they're not popular. They don't feel good about themselves. But then there are those kids that are kind of more the quiet, I don't want to say outcast, but maybe the introverted ones, those ones who are doing the passive scrolling and such. They're having anxiety because they don't fit in. They're not meeting that criteria that they're seeing, that unrealistic, filtered reels that are out there. And again, as I said, we're seeing that with adults too, with influencers and the content, because we know they're selling things, but they're presenting with perfect house, children all perfect, and perfect jobs, and we see this, but yet our brains are like, oh, we're not thinking that it's not real. We're just seeing it. And I think that's really influencing the way we do everything that we do, which is causing a lot of anxiety and depression and other things.
Debbie, I want to talk about two more things. And one of the things we want to do on this podcast is give information. And I think this is great information. And then some pointers of how to turn a corner. So two questions. The first question is, how can technology benefit mental health? So, thank God we have opportunities for telehealth and those types of things, that we never had before. But how do you see technology being a benefit to mental health? We'll talk about boundaries in a second, but let's just talk about ways that technology can benefit us in our mental health.
Yeah, I mean, I think, technology helps mental health in that ease of access. Again, as I was talking about at the beginning, there's always a stigma about mental health, and people don't really understand what it is. And the people that have mental health, they're often isolated. And so with this, with technology, there's a lot of support groups. There's a lot of people who have mental health issues that are actually, getting on TikTok, getting on Instagram, talking about their anxiety and depression, making it seem like, okay, it's not such a scary thing, that this is what my symptoms are like. And, I've done this, the support group, or I've done this modality and this helps. So I think that is a big player in all this. And again, there's, so many different communities online that people can access. There's tools that people can access. There's things that you can download for anxiety. There's ideas. You can go on Pinterest and even come up with ideas for, anxiety and depression or things to help with your children. So I think that basically that ease of access is what's really helping with mental illness. But I do caution people to be careful with the information because, much like WebMD, there's lots of information about diseases and symptoms, but if you don't have maybe a better understanding of it, or if you're not under kind of care, you might seek out misinformation. And that's what's tough, because if you don't know better, know any better, you might kind of, accept that misinformation as a fact, and you start to, maybe use techniques that might end up being more detrimental in the long run.
The great passage in Philippians talks about, in Philippians chapter 2 or 4 rather, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds through Jesus Christ. And then it says, finally, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think on these things. And, so often technology puts us into a passive mode where we're getting things fed to us. Scripture is saying, by the power of the Holy Spirit, here are the things you need to be thinking about. Here are the things you need to be putting into your mind. Certainly, there are things, podcasts or teaching or things that would help us in that. I think there, like you say, there's some great opportunities where we can grow in those areas. So as you think about the Philippians passage and honorable and pure and lovely and commendable and excellence, as we kind of wrap up, Debbie, give us some good practical advice about how we can set boundaries around technology so that it doesn't control us, so that we're in charge and we're using it as a great tool instead of being used by it.
Right. So I wrote down a few things, and I kind of divided it with age groups, and I think this will help because I think it's important for parents out there to realize that if you are one of those parents that inadvertently give your kids, you know, tech to kind of help, it's not always lost, and I don't want you to think you're a bad parent, because you're not. Sometimes we do these things because we're trying to keep peace in the family, and we're trying to keep, we're trying to just survive day to day. So I get that. But the first thing I put is role modeling. So, we ask a lot of our kids, but we also need to make sure that we're doing the role modeling ourselves. So, when it comes to technology, we as parents need to not always be on our devices, especially when we're in front of the kids. We need to learn to put things down. So I just kind of wanted to put that out. But for younger kids, a couple things I put. One of the things I talked about is tech swap. So
I'm gonna stop you there. That's a great point. Kids really do see us, what we're doing, and if we're always have a phone, they're going to think that's just the way you do life. And if we always have a phone, it's going to be hard for us to tell them, hey, this isn't the way you do it, because it's show and tell, right? Not only do I have to say what I know to be true, I have to do it in front of them. So really being conscious about not using a phone in front of them as much, not having a phone at dinner time, not always saying, "Oh, this is so important. I have to take this call, or I have to," because that just makes them think whoever's calling, and they may not know who it is, that's more important than me at this time. So I didn't want to interrupt you, but I just wanted to drill down on that. I just think that's an excellent point. Role modeling is just part of what parents do.
yeah, leading by example. And and if you get, even more specific, it's social learning theory, right? So our kids in all things are really oftentimes going to mimic what we do. So, we're not always going to be perfect, but it is important that if you're asking your kid to do something, you really, you need to not be do as I say, not as I do kind of a thing. So I do think role modeling is really important. And it is hard because parents don't see that, because we always have our phones on, So tech swap is something that I think is really important for children. For every 30 minutes of screen time, replace it with what I was talking about at the beginning, like 30 minutes of some hands-on play, building blocks, drawing, reading aloud, because those are things that, some parents are allowing their digital stuff to do, kind of replace those important things. I talked about a calm down kit. Instead of giving a tablet when your kid is upset or frustrated, providing more sensory stuff, clay, Play-Doh, sand trays are so important. If you're a parent out there and you don't have a sand tray, make one. And I don't know, Ron, if you know what I'm talking about, but sand trays, we use sand trays in counseling. So you think about a sandbox, right? So sand trays you can have them multiple sizes. I probably have 4 of them at my house, and you can put little figurines in them. And sand trays, you feel the sand. You can use imagination as you play with different figurines and different things in the sand tray. You can use kinetic sand, which is really not messy, or you can use regular sand. But I highly recommend it. You can, you may not want to bring a sand tray to a restaurant, but, you could definitely have it in your house for those kind of things.
I could play with kinetic sand all day
Oh,
long. That stuff's cool.
oh, I love it. And different colors. It's fantastic,
So let's go. So tech swap, I like that. So 30 minutes on a screen, 30 minutes off a screen, so that you got some balance there. And then calm down kit. Instead of saying, hey, watch this YouTube video because you're acting up in a restaurant or in public, whatever, be prepared, take that kit and take it with you, and whatever it has in it, crayons or whatever. Use your parenting skills, and your kid. You know what your kid likes, and then sand trays to kind of help your child use their imagination at home. I like that. That's good.
Yeah, and it's also part of social skills. So, when you're playing with a sand tray or you're encouraging your child to not be on screen, you're taking the time to help them role play, use imagination. They can use their dolls, figurines, cars, whatever. But it's really important to make eye contact with your child. It's really important to teach your child to make eye contact with other people. So part of that is normal developmental skills that we used to do back in the day, because we didn't really have anything else to do but play, and so I'm not saying that it was better, but in a lot of ways, I think we're seeing more behavioral issues nowadays than we did before. Could be for a lot of reasons, but that's just kind of one of them. I think it's just probably like being intentional, being in that moment with your child is really important. So that's for little kids. Now, I think it's important for older kids. So I talk about a couple things, reality checks. And what I wrote here is identify 3 ways social media distorts reality through the use of filters or highlight reels. So again, we talked about in past podcasts about having like family meetings, and things like that. So it's really important for parents to talk with their child and do a reality check. Okay, hey, let's talk about this person you're following. Are they using body positive images, or can you tell these are highly filtered? So how do you think that distorts it? Because it's really important for kids to say, oh wow, that's not real. And then it kind of takes the pressure off of them that they don't have to actually imitate that because it's unrealistic. So that's one thing. The next thing, and you talked about this too at the beginning, is definitely to have digital curfews. Now, again, if you haven't done this already, I would recommend implementing these slowly, because if all of a sudden somebody watches this podcast and they say to their teenager, we're doing this, that, you might have a little bit of, some trouble with your teenager saying, no, I'm not going to do that. But the reason why digital curfews are so important, again, I talked about that hour before you go to sleep. If you're looking at the blue screen, or you're looking at even watching television, it's those lights and all that stuff that's kind of affecting your brain. Your melatonin, it just can't produce the way it normally does. So then we deal with these sleep disruptions. And, we've talked about before how sleep disruptions can cause a whole host of things. So instead of, falling asleep watching television, or, having your smartphone right next to you, do things like that are old-fashioned things like journaling, reading, those things that are paper and you open, the kids don't necessarily know about. Reading, it's so important because it just is great for your brain. And really, even that, is healthy, not necessarily going to give you boosts of dopamine, but it's going to encourage you and it's going to calm you down. Listening to calming music. You might have like a playlist at night that is just for sleep, listening to nature, whatever it is you decide to do. But I think the key is stopping, the smartphones, stopping the tablets a good hour before you go to bed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But Mom, Dad, my phone is my alarm clock.
Well, put the phone a little bit away from you. So, it doesn't have to be right next to you. I actually think it's better to have your phone away from you, because I don't really know what the phone is doing to your brain if it's sleeping right next to you. So I don't have that kind of research, but also for kids that have a hard time waking up, if they physically have to get out of bed to shut their alarm off, they might get up a little bit easier. So,
I think they still sell those old alarm clocks.
Yeah,
not sure.
Exactly. I think those are great. I mean, I use my cell phone to wake me up, but I don't look at it before I go to bed, because otherwise it'll drive me crazy. But also, I think another thing, there's so many things to do, but when talking about older kids is content cleanse. And this is really important because I think, as parents, if we can have this kind of relationship with our kids where we talk, and that those family meetings where we're open about things, if you have that kind of relationship or you develop that kind, you can talk to your kids about the content that they're looking at and, those ones that again are unrealistic, and then encourage your child to unfollow those. Because, I'll tell you, I know kids out there are following everybody that they can, click, follow this person. And a lot of it's unrealistic. So I highly recommend kind of, being, being that kind of parent that is not, you don't want to be a nag. You don't want to be a mean kind of a parent, but you want to be a parent that teaches their children why these things are important. You don't have to just be so, okay, you're doing it because I say so, but you're kind of working together, and that really kind of creates that atmosphere where, my parents are trustworthy because they really have my best in mind, so you're not really coming down on them, but again, other things, tech-free hour. Everybody in the family should do this at night if you can. For an hour at night, not saying dinner, because at dinner I don't think there should ever be any type of technology. But after dinner, whenever, put all your phones in a basket, play a board game, go for a walk, even cook together. There's lots of things that you can implement that the kids aren't like, oh, this is boring, but you make it fun. There's so many things you can do. Prioritize. And this is part of setting boundaries, prioritize, you as a parent. Okay, I'm going to work. If I work at home, I'm going to work to this time. And then I'm going to shut my stuff off and really be present with my family. Because you'll see family members, and I see them at restaurants, they feel like it's okay because they're all sitting together, but they're sitting together not making connections. And that's a real problem. And we're seeing a lot of just frustration, disconnection, not only between parents and kids, but between husbands and wives. It really goes across all age groups.
Right. Maybe that is good stuff. That's good stuff. So reality checks. Who are you following? And the part I love about this is you're having conversations with your kids about it. So who are you following? Is that a positive thing for you? YouTube videos. What are you watching? What are the things doom scrolling? You can spend hours wasting time on that and then run into some very unhealthy videos along the way. Digital curfews. So here's the time we put our phones down. We're not going to use them. If something happens in the middle of the night, I can't do anything about it anyway. So I can respond in the morning. Content cleanse. I got to be some things on there that I don't need and that I shouldn't. And then tech-free hour. I love those. Those are great. Thanks for sharing those.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And you can come up with your own too as a parent, and I think too, what I didn't mention, which I think is just kind of probably, maybe common sense to some extent, is make sure you put on locks on your younger children's, older children's, there's all kinds of parental controls and things. And I highly recommend that because, again, when you give your 10-year-old a smartphone and they're up in the room, even if it's not at night, again, as you mentioned, YouTube, there are lots of unsavory things on YouTube and just, dangers. There's a lot of dangers on the internet for children and adults.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe that's good stuff, man. I appreciate you doing this. We're going to do it again, but this is really good information, not only just information, but some practical tools to give parents. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this.
No problem.
Really appreciate it. All right. We'll have you back on and we'll come up with those listening. If you have questions for Debbie, if you have things you want to talk about, let us know, and we'll develop an episode around some of the questions that parents are asking.
Yeah, Sounds good to me.
Good deal. Hey, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
No problem.
Hey, thanks so much for joining this episode of Living Grounded. I want to thank Debbie Schratz. Man, she always does such a great job. I just love her perspective, and particularly today, on how we can live well and stay well in a world that's always on. If this conversation resonated with you, we'd love for you to share it with someone who could use a little digital breathing room. And don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps others find their way back to what really matters. Until next time, keep living grounded. Hey, I want to thank our podcast team for making this episode possible. Our executive director is Jen Booth. Ryan Jorgen produces each podcast. Mark James delivers each podcast right to you, and Laura Crane promotes each episode through social media. Again, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and be sure to share this episode with those who need it. Until next time, keep living grounded.